The arrival 15,000 to 10,000 BC, long before the names of nations and kingdoms ever took shape. When the world was locked in the quiet breath of ice, a people began to move. They did not know they were crossing into a new continent. They only followed the wind, the stars, and the promise of land that stretched beyond the white horizon. The year was not a year as we count it, perhaps 15,000 years before the first cities would rise in Mesopotamia. Earth's great ice sheets still covered much of the north. Two enormous glaciers, the Laurentide and the Corduron, lay across what we now call Canada, pressing down the land beneath them with a weight so vast that the Earth's crust sagged. Between those sheets of ice and the frozen Arctic Ocean beyond was a bridge of land, Beringia. Today it lies beneath the Bering Sea, between Alaska and Siberia. But then it was a world unto itself, a wide plain of tundra and steppe, where woolly mammoths wandered and ancient rivers cut through dry valleys. It was neither Asia nor America, but a corridor between them. On that corridor, in the biting wind and pale sun, walked the ancestors of the first Americans. They were hunters, family groups bound by endurance and memory. They carried sharpened blades of flint, curved bone needles, and simple tools that had carried their kind across thousands of miles. We do not know their words, but we know their skill. In their wake, they left the marks of fire, chipped stone, and footprints pressed into one sweat clay, silent signatures of the first humans to set foot in the Americas. Crossing the bridge of wind and ice, archaeologists traced their path through a handful of ancient sites. In Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, bones of extinct horses and mammoths show human cut marks dated to nearly 24,000 years ago, suggesting people may have waited there through the coldest centuries before moving south. Far to the south, in Monteverde and chilly wooden stakes and preserved food, remains hint at a human settlement that existed before. 14,500 BC evidence that the migration was not a single wave, but a slow, branching story. These discoveries challenge the once familiar tale of a single migration during a narrow window of time. Instead, it seems likely that many groups, separated by generations, drifted eastward along the Beringian corridor, or followed the coasts by boat and foot, tracing the edges of ice-free shores. For centuries, Beringia was not a crossing but a home, a grassland larger than many modern nations, rich with bison, horses, and mammoth. It may have supported entire communities for thousands of years, their camps rising and fading like mirages across the cold plain. And when the glaciers began to melt, roughly 13,000 years ago, they opened what scientists call the ice-free corridor, a stretch of land between the retreating ice sheets. Through that passage, hunters moved southward into what we now call the Great Plains. The world they entered was raw and immense. Forests began to spread where ice had receded, rivers carved new routes. And across the prairies, great herds of mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison roamed the thawing earth. The Clovis Trail, it is here that the most famous of all early American cultures appeared, the Clovis people, named after a site near Clovis, New Mexico, where beautifully fluted spear points were first discovered in the 1930s. For decades, the Clovis's first theory stood as the accepted story that around 13,000 BC, these were the very first inhabitants of the continent. They hunted with weapons of remarkable precision, each point shaped with a central groove or flute, allowing it to fit tightly to a wooden shaft. Clovis tools have been found across almost all of North America, from Arizona to Pennsylvania, from Montana to Florida. Such spread suggests not a single tribe, but a network of groups sharing ideas, trade, and a common way of life. To hunt the giant beasts of the plains, they worked together, driving herds toward natural traps or into the open where the swiftest hunters could strike. A single mammoth could feed a band for weeks, its hide used for tents, its bones for tools and shelter frames, its fat for fire. Yet even as Clovis's culture thrived, the world around them was changing. The Ice Age was ending. Glaciers retreated northward. The climate grew warmer and wetter. Within only a few millennia, the megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, began to vanish. Some scientists see in this extinction the hand of human hunters. Others point to the rapid shift in temperature and vegetation. Most likely it was both. If the giants disappeared, so too did the old way of life. The broad Clovis spear points were replaced by smaller, more efficient designs, the Folsom points. Around 10,000 BC, these were used to hunt smaller game such as bison and deer, signaling a people adapting swiftly to a changing earth. Life at the edge of change, the Paleo-Indian world was one of movement. Small bands wandered the valleys and high plains, following herds, tracing rivers, watching the seasons. They built no cities, raised no monuments, yet their footprints can still be found in the mud of ancient lakes and the layers of forgotten caves. In one site in Colorado, called Lindenmeyer, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of Folsom points and animal bones, proof of a camp that may have lasted through multiple generations. In another, at Galt site in Texas, thousands of stone tools show not chaos but craftsmanship, a deliberate shaping of blades that suggests teaching, learning, and shared knowledge. They knew fire intimately, how to coax it from flint and tinder, how to use it to cook, to harden wood, to drive game. They crafted clothing from hides sewn with bone needles. They carried what they owned on their backs, moving lightly across the land, leaving behind hearths and stories carried by memory rather than written word. To imagine their lives is to imagine a world in balance, fragile, cold, and beautiful, nights lit by the aurora, winters spent near frozen rivers, sound of ice cracking like distant thunder. They were not primitive wanderers. They were skilled survivors. The changing earth and the human tide, by the time the great herds began to thin, the world itself was transforming. The cold grip of the Ice Age was loosening, and the familiar outlines of the continent we know today were beginning to take shape. Where once sheets of ice stretched for hundreds of miles, meltwater now carved rivers, filled lakes, and gave birth to fertile valleys. In this shifting landscape, the descendants of the first wanderers adapted again and again. They no longer followed only mammoth or bison. They turned to smaller prey, deer, elk, antelope, rabbits, and learned the delicate rhythm of seasonal living. What had begun as survival on the move was slowly becoming an understanding of place. They built camps where rivers met. They gathered at lakes for the spring hunt and returned again when the salmon ran. The rhythm of migration began to follow not just animals, but the turning of the seasons, the flowering of plants, and the ripening of berries. Archaeologists call this time the late Paleo-Indian, or transitional period, a bridge between worlds. Tools, diets, and lifeways were constantly refined. The Folsom legacy. Around what is now New Mexico, a group of hunters tracked a herd of ancient bison into a shallow basin. When they brought the animals down, they butchered them carefully, leaving behind a record in bone and stone. Thousands of years later, a rancher, this discovery of a single fluted point lodged in the ribs of an extinct bison revealed one of the great milestones of American archaeology, the Folsom site. Unlike the larger Clovis points, Folsom blades were smaller, thinner, more symmetrical, a sign of innovation and precision. They reflected not decline but mastery, a response to the disappearance of giant prey. These hunters worked obsidian, chert, and jasper into flawless projectiles that could pierce deep into muscle and bone. Every strike of the flint, every flake removed, carried knowledge passed from one generation to the next, knowledge that linked fathers, mothers, and children in a chain of survival older than memory itself. Across the Great Plains, Folsom bands thrived. They moved with the herds, but also traded stone, pigment, and stories with neighboring groups. The continent was beginning to weave itself into a subtle web of human connection. Beyond the plains, while the Folsom hunters pursued bison in the heartland, other peoples adapted to entirely different worlds. Far to the west, in what is now Nevada and Utah, small communities settled in the dry basins and canyons of the Great Basin. Here, lakes that once shimmered under Ice Age skies like Lake Bonneville and Lake Lahontan were shrinking into salt flats. Life demanded versatility. Families gathered seeds of wild grasses, hunted jackrabbits, and learned to store food for lean months. Their stone tools were delicate, their baskets tightly woven, and their shelters built from reeds and brush. This would become the foundation for the desert archaic cultures that would thrive for millennia after. In the forests of the Pacific coast, others followed salmon runs and collected shellfish, leaving behind middens, heaps of shells and bones that still mark ancient shorelines. In the far north, early ancestors of the Inuit and Aleut adapted to frozen coasts, crafting harpoons from bone and antler to hunt seals and walruses. Everywhere the ice withdrew, people were already there, ready to meet the new world that emerged from beneath it. Footprints in stone and spirit archaeological discoveries from this time read like whispers from the dark edges of time. In the shadowed chambers of Paisley Caves in Oregon, fragments of human DNA found in ancient coprolites, fossilized remains prove that humans were there more than 14,000 years ago. Farther east, at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, layers of hearths and stone flakes stretch back nearly 16,000 years, suggesting generations of continuous occupation. Each layer of ash, each broken blade, each charcoal stain is a verse in the story of humanity's first chapter in the Americas. And woven among the artifacts are hints of something more, symbols carved into bone. Pigments mixed for color, beads shaped from shell and ivory. Though rare, these small acts of art suggest that the earliest Americans, like all humans, sought meaning in the world around them. They might have painted the hunt to honor the spirits of animals, or adorned the dead to guide them beyond. Whatever their beliefs, they show a consciousness that reached beyond survival, a desire to understand their place in the living earth. The disappearing giants, the warming earth, brought abundance and also loss. The Pleistocene megafauna, those towering creatures that had dominated the landscape for tens of thousands of years, began to vanish one by one. By around 10,000 BC, mammoths had disappeared from most of North America. Mastodons followed soon after. Giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and short-faced bears faded from the fossil record. Scientists still debate why. Some point to overhunting, the so-called Pleistocene overkill hypothesis, noting the coincidence between human expansion and animal extinction. Others argue that the warming climate disrupted habitats faster than animals could adapt. The truth may lie in the union of both forces, nature shifting and humanity pressing forward together. For the people who lived through it, the change would have felt like the dimming of an older world. The great beasts that had sustained their ancestors vanished, forcing them to look closer to smaller game, to rivers and plants, to the intricate pulse of an earth reborn. Adapting to a new rhythm, the end of the Ice Age was not a single event, but a slow awakening that lasted centuries. Rain replaced snow, tundra became meadow, then forest. New species, deer, turkey, freshwater fish, filled the spaces left behind. Human life shifted with them. Where once there had been great hunts across frozen plains, now there were smaller bands who camped near rivers, fished with bone hooks, and trapped birds and rodents. They discovered edible roots, berries, and nuts, experimenting with ways to grind, cook, and preserve them. By the dawn of 8000 BC, the outlines of the Archaic period were emerging, a world where people no longer simply followed animals, but began to understand the land itself, its cycles, its seasons, its gifts. The Paleo-Indian story was not ending. It was transforming. Out of the hunters of the mammoth would come the gatherers, fishers, and seed planters who would one day build mounds, shape pottery, and give birth to the first settled societies of North America. The dawn of the Archaic world, 10,000 to 8,000 BC, the Ice Age had loosened its grip, across the land that would one day be called America. The white silence of glaciers gave way to sound, the trickle of meltwater, the rush of new rivers, the chorus of life returning. Forests crept northward where tundra once lay. Spruce and pine gave way to birch and oak. Wildflowers spread across plains that had only centuries before been buried under walls of ice. And among the trees moved people, no longer the mammoth hunters of legend, but families and kin groups learning to live in a world that had changed forever. They had not vanished with the great beasts. They had adapted. What began as a migration across a continent was now a quiet flowering of cultures, each finding its rhythm in the turning of the seasons. A world of water and forests. By around 10,000 BC, North America had become a continent of rivers and lakes. The Mississippi Valley, once a frozen trough, now carried floods of glacial melt. The Great Lakes filled their basins, linking the heart of the continent to the Atlantic by endless waterways. Along these shores, camps rose and fell, small clusters of hide shelters, hearths blackened with charcoal, and the smell of smoke drifting through morning mist. For the first time, people stayed longer in one place. They built seasonal homes near reliable water and food. They returned year after year, leaving behind layers of ash and tools, the first faint traces of semi-permanent living. Fish became a new staple. Bone harpoons, barbed points, and nets appeared in the archaeological record. In floodplains and marshes, they trapped turtles and gathered edible plants. They learned which roots to bake to remove their bitterness, which seeds could be roasted, and which leaves carried medicine. This knowledge, passed down orally, never written, was the seed of a new relationship with the earth. The rise of regional traditions. Across the vastness of the continent, human life began to diversify. Climate, geography, and resources shaped each community's way of being. In the Great Plains, where bison still roamed, hunters perfected lighter dart points and the otlot, a throwing stick that could propel a spear with greater speed and distance. In the eastern woodlands, thick forests offered deer, bear, and wild turkeys. People there developed tools suited for cutting and scraping wood axes, adzes, and ground stone implements. Farther south, in what is now Texas and northern Mexico, the dry grasslands produced cultures skilled in seed gathering and plant use. Grinding stones, manos, and matotes appeared for the first time, showing that wild grains were being processed into meal. Each adaptation reflected observation, patience, and ingenuity. Nothing was wasted, nothing taken without purpose. The people who had once crossed continents now measured their world by the bend of a river, the call of migrating birds, the flowering of certain plants, signs that guided their movement and their survival. Tools of transition, the stone technology of this age, tells a story of quiet transformation. Clovis and Folsom fluted points, once used for mammoth and bison, gave way to a multitude of regional styles, stemmed, notched, corner-based. Form had meaning, a subtle optimization for the prey, the wood used for shafts, or the hand that wielded it. Groundstone tools also emerged, axes polished smooth, pestles worn from years of use, and grooved stones that may have served as weights for nets. Such tools required patience and planning, signs that life was no longer a constant rush between hunts, but a cycle of making, maintaining, and preparing. Fire continued to be their silent companion. With it, they hardened wood, baked clay, and reshaped landscapes, burning patches of forest to encourage new plant growth and attract game. In these small acts lay the earliest hints of land management, a forerunner to cultivation. Echoes of belief. The people of this era left few monuments, but their presence can still be felt in the soil. Burial sites from around 9000 BC reveal care for the dead, bodies laid with red ochre, tools, and ornaments. Ochre, that deep iron-rich pigment, appears in graves from Alaska to Florida, suggesting a shared reverence for color and transformation. At Windover Pond in Florida, a site dated to roughly 8000 BC, archaeologists uncovered a remarkable window into this world. At a peat bog that preserved organic remains, they found dozens of burials, men, women, and children, their bodies wrapped in woven fabric. Beside them lay baskets, carved wooden stakes, and artifacts of bone and antler. The people of Windover lived near wetlands, fishing and gathering plants. Their tools were crafted with care. Their community organized enough to return to the same sacred ground generation after generation. They were no longer merely surviving, they were living with intention, building memory into the land. A climate of challenge, yet the new warmth brought uncertainty as well. The end of the Ice Age unleashed floods and storms as massive glacial lakes burst their boundaries. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet, swallowing ancient coastal plains. Islands and shorelines vanished, taking with them entire chapters of human habitation now lost beneath the waves. What we see today is only part of the story, the inland fragments that survived erosion and time. But even in these fragments, a pattern emerges: resilience. Wherever the world changed, people adapted to rising seas, shifting forests, drying lakes. Humanity had become not a guest of the continent, but part of its heartbeat. The long continuum by 8000 BC, the age we call Paleo-Indian, was giving way to the Archaic. The hunters of mammoth had become the gatherers of acorns and wild rice. Communities learned to weave fiber into cordage, 2 hollow logs into canoes, to smoke and store meat. Populations grew slowly, but their ties to the land deepened. They were the ancestors of everything that would come of the mound builders. The farmers, the artists, and the storytellers who would one day call this continent home. Theirs was not the dawn of civilization as we often define it. No temples or cities, but something subtler, and perhaps older, a harmony between humanity and the living world. As the last shadows of the Ice Age faded, a new chapter began. It would be written not in the language of survival, but in the quiet grammar of belonging. From ice to earth, the closing of the Paleo-Indian age. 8000 BC, the ice had retreated to the farthest north. Across a continent reborn, grasslands shimmered where tundra had once stretched to the horizon. The earth was warming, not in a rush, but in long, patient breaths, centuries of thawing, flooding, renewal. And with that change, the last echoes of the old world, the world of the great hunters, began to fade. The vanishing giants for countless generations. The people of North America had lived beside enormous creatures, the mammoth, the mastodon, the giant ground sloth, the saber-toothed cat. But by 8000 BC, these animals were gone. Their bones lay buried in clay, their tusks softened by time. Why they disappeared remains one of prehistory's enduring questions. Some scientists see the warming climate as the cause. Grasslands shrinking, forests spreading, and the great herds losing the open plains they needed. Others point to human ingenuity, the mastery of the spear, the precision of organized hunts that may have pressed those species past recovery. Perhaps it was both. For the people who lived through it, it must have felt like the world itself was changing beneath their feet. The familiar prey vanished. The rhythms of life shifted. They had to learn new ways to live, new ways to eat, to think, to move. In this quiet crisis, the first great transformation of the Americas began, adapting to the new earth. As the mammoths vanished, the land filled with smaller life. Deer, elk, beaver, rabbit, and countless birds flourished. Rivers thick with fish became highways of nourishment. The people followed these resources no longer across continents, but within them. Instead of long, sweeping migrations, they began seasonal rounds, moving between valleys, uplands, and lakeshores as the year turned. A rhythm of movement and return. They learned to predict the blooming of berries, the spawning of fish, the migration of waterfowl. They began to store food, drying meat, smoking fish, catching nuts in pits lined with bark. Each new adaptation wove them tighter into the living fabric of the land, and as their world diversified, so did they. The birth of many worlds by 7500 BC, North America was no longer a single cultural landscape. It had become a mosaic of regional traditions, each shaped by terrain, resources, and climate. In the Pacific Northwest, vast forests and salmon runs sustained communities whose descendants would one day craft towering cedar totems. In the Great Basin, the desert valleys of present-day Nevada and Utah, small family groups wandered between shrinking lakes, leaving behind delicate obsidian points and woven sandals preserved in caves. Far to the east, the woodland forests nurtured a quieter revolution. Their groups began to shape their environment with fire, burning underbrush to encourage new growth, to attract deer and open paths. This was the first hint of landscape design, of intentional, ecological balance. Everywhere, people watched the world closely, learning its new language of abundance and loss. The human story beneath the soil. Archaeology captures these moments not as grand monuments but as traces. A hearth ringed with stone, a scatter of spear points near a riverbank, a burial dusted with red ochre and lined with shells. Each layer tells us that even in an age before writing, memory was preserved not in words but in place. In a Tennessee valley, archaeologists uncovered tools made from river chert, worn smooth by generations of use. In the Dakotas, bones of bison reveal new hunting methods. Smaller herds pursued with strategy, not strength. And along the Atlantic coast, campsites show evidence of shellfish gathering, marking the earliest steps toward coastal economies that would thrive for millennia. These fragments whisper of families who laughed around fires, who mourned their dead, who watched stars and told stories of how they came to be. Humanity, though scattered, was never alone. Memory of the old ways. Even as new life ways flourished, the old stories must have endured. Memories of the white horizon, of herds that thundered across frozen earth, of ancestors who followed them from a distant land of endless dusk. Perhaps they spoke of a time when ice touched the sea, when the world was narrower and the sun hung low. Such memories, retold through generations, may have become myth tales of giants and spirits, of journeys across land that no longer existed. Myth, after all, is history remembered in the language of the heart. The quiet transition, no single moment marks the end of the Paleo-Indian age. There was no line drawn in the soil, no great change that all could see. It ended as all ages do, slowly, imperceptibly, in the turning of seasons. The spear points changed shape. The camps grew larger, the people stayed longer. The ice withdrew, and with it the urgency of endless wandering. They had survived the coldest epoch of human history and emerged into a warmer, wetter world. They had crossed continents, hunted giants, and learned the ways of 1,000 new landscapes. The world ahead, the archaic world, would bring challenges of its own. New tools, new ideas, and the first stirrings of the villages and trade networks that would one day shape civilizations. But before that future began, the earth rested green, alive, and waiting. As the archaic world fades into dusk, new societies stir on the horizon. People who will raise mounds that touch the sky, craft pottery that carries memory, and cultivate the first fields that will feed generations. Their time is coming, and their story begins in the next chapter. If this journey through ancient North America drew you in, stay with us. Share your thoughts in the comments, tell us what captured your imagination, and let's keep history alive together. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on the bell so you'll be here when the next chapter begins, the Woodland Age, when the earth itself became sacred. Until then.